Have you ever stared at your phone for hours, wondering how someone who once replied so fast suddenly became completely silent? Have you ever read old conversations again and again, trying to figure out what changed, what mistake you made, or why the energy suddenly disappeared without warning? Because the truth is, nothing confuses the human mind more than silence from someone we emotionally connected to, especially when that silence comes from an avoidant person. And what makes it even more painful is this. They do not always leave with anger. Sometimes there is no argument, no goodbye, no clear ending, just distance, delayed replies, cold energy, then suddenly, nothing. And your mind starts creating stories that slowly destroy your peace. Maybe they found someone else. Maybe they got bored. Maybe you were too much. Maybe you said the wrong thing. Maybe you were not enough. This is what silence does to the human brain. It creates emotional chaos. Because people can heal from rejection faster than uncertainty. Rejection gives an answer, silence gives endless questions, and those unanswered questions become emotional torture. So if an avoidant has stopped replying to you recently, stay until the end of this video, because by the end, you are going to understand what is truly happening inside their mind, why this silence affects you so deeply psychologically, and most importantly, how to stop this situation from emotionally controlling your life. What you learn today may completely change the way you see avoidance forever. Most people think being ignored is just about communication, but psychologically it goes much deeper than that. Human beings are emotionally wired for connection. We seek reassurance. We seek emotional safety. And when someone suddenly disappears emotionally, the nervous system reacts as if something dangerous is happening. That is why your chest feels heavy. That is why you keep checking your phone every few minutes, even when you know no message is coming. That is why your concentration disappears, your appetite changes, your sleep becomes restless, your mind becomes addicted to finding answers. Because silence creates obsession, the brain hates emotional uncertainty. It keeps searching for closure like a person lost in a dark room searching for a door. And every hour without a reply feels personal. Every delay feels intentional. Every moment of silence starts attacking your self-worth. You begin measuring your value through someone else's response time. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop living your own life emotionally. You become mentally trapped inside theirs. You replay conversations trying to decode hidden meanings. You overanalyze short replies. You remember the warmth they once gave you and compare it to the cold distance they show now. And the hardest part is this. The person who created comfort inside you has suddenly become the source of your anxiety. That emotional contradiction is devastating for the human mind, because one part of you wants to let go, but another part keeps holding on to hope. Hope that maybe they are just busy, maybe they are overwhelmed, maybe tomorrow they will suddenly come back and explain everything. So you wait emotionally, you pause your healing, you pause your peace, you pause yourself. This is why silence from an avoidant feels different from normal rejection. It creates an emotional limbo. You are neither fully connected nor fully disconnected, and the human heart suffers deeply in uncertainty. But here is something most people never realize. When an avoidant stops replying, your mind immediately focuses on their behavior, but you stop noticing what is happening to yourself internally. You stop noticing how quickly emotional neglect can make a strong person abandon their own confidence. You stop noticing how much power you are giving to someone else's attention. And this is exactly why so many people lose themselves while chasing clarity from emotionally unavailable people. The painful truth is that silence activates childhood wounds inside many people. The fear of abandonment, the fear of not being chosen, the fear of being emotionally forgotten. That is why this situation hurts far deeper than a simple unanswered message. It touches insecurities that existed long before this person entered your life, and avoidants often trigger those wounds unintentionally. One moment, they make you feel deeply wanted. The next moment, they disappear emotionally. That inconsistency creates emotional addiction. Psychologically, unpredictable affection affects the brain more intensely than consistent affection, because uncertainty increases emotional attachment. The mind starts craving validation stronger and stronger. This is why you cannot simply stop thinking about them. Your nervous system has become emotionally attached to the pattern, and the more silence continues, the louder your inner fears become. You start questioning your attractiveness, your worth, your importance. You compare yourself to others. You become emotionally exhausted trying to solve a puzzle that gives no answers. And many people reach a point where they no longer even want love. They just want relief from overthinking. But listen carefully. The silence of an avoidant is not always as simple as people think it is. Most people see the silence and assume one thing: they do not care. But human psychology is rarely that black and white, especially with avoidant personalities. Because sometimes the person going silent is also fighting an internal battle you cannot see. Sometimes distance is not created from hatred. Sometimes it comes from emotional overwhelm, fear, confusion, or internal shutdown. Now, that does not excuse unhealthy behavior, but understanding the psychology behind it changes everything. Because once you understand what is truly happening internally, you stop personalizing every moment of silence. And when you stop personalizing it, you begin reclaiming your emotional power. In the next part, you are going to discover what is really happening inside the avoidant mind when they stop replying. And the truth may completely challenge everything you believed about emotional distance. What makes this situation so difficult to understand is that avoidants rarely look emotionally overwhelmed on the outside. They often appear calm, distant, unaffected, or completely detached. And because of that, people assume there is no emotional struggle happening internally, but many times the exact opposite is true. An avoidant can care deeply about someone and still disappear from them emotionally. That is the contradiction most people never fully understand. To the outside world, replying to a message seems simple. It takes seconds. But internally, for someone with avoidant patterns, emotional connection can feel far more intense than they know how to manage. The closer the bond becomes, the more pressure their nervous system begins to feel. Not because love is bad, but because closeness activates fears they learned to suppress long ago. Many avoidants were never taught how to process vulnerable emotions safely. Somewhere in their early emotional development, they learned that depending on others creates discomfort, that expressing too much creates risk, that emotional exposure can lead to disappointment, criticism, rejection, or loss of control. So instead of learning how to move through emotions, they learned how to disconnect from them. And over time, emotional distancing became survival. This is why an avoidant may pull away exactly when things start becoming more meaningful, right when conversations become deeper, right when attachment becomes stronger, right when the relationship begins feeling emotionally real. Because intimacy does not only create connection for them, it also creates internal pressure. And when that pressure becomes overwhelming, their mind searches for relief. That relief often comes through silence, not always because they want to hurt someone, not always because they stopped caring, but because creating distance temporarily helps them escape feelings they do not know how to regulate internally. While another person moves closer during emotional intensity, the avoidant moves backward to regain emotional control. This is why their behavior can feel so confusing. One day they are warm, engaged, present, and emotionally available. Then suddenly they become slower, colder, quieter, harder to reach, and the shift feels almost unreal. But internally, what often changes is not their feelings. It is their level of emotional overwhelm. Many avoidants experience something people rarely talk about: emotional flooding. This happens when emotions become so intense that the nervous system starts treating connection like stress instead of comfort. Even positive emotions can trigger this response. Affection, closeness, vulnerability, expectations, all of it can feel emotionally heavy inside someone who never learned secure emotional regulation. So instead of communicating clearly, they retreat internally. And the painful part is that many avoidants do not even fully understand themselves while this is happening. They only know they suddenly feel pressure, confusion, exhaustion, or the need to escape. They may convince themselves they need space. They may distract themselves with work, entertainment, routines, or isolation. Anything to quiet the emotional intensity growing inside them. But emotions delayed are not emotions erased. This is important to understand. Just because someone becomes silent does not mean their mind becomes peaceful. In fact, many avoidants continue thinking about the person constantly after pulling away. The difference is that they process emotions in isolation instead of through connection. They withdraw first and try to understand their feelings later. That is why their silence can last days, weeks, or even months. Not because nothing exists internally, but because too much exists internally. And this creates another hidden struggle. Many avoidants feel guilt while they are distant. They know their behavior affects people. They know someone is waiting, wondering, hurting, or searching for answers. But the more guilt they feel, the harder communication becomes. Because now the message is no longer normal. Now it carries emotional weight. Now they fear confrontation, emotional discussions, disappointment, or pressure they do not feel ready to handle. So they delay responding even more. And every day that passes increases the emotional tension inside them. This is why avoidants often get trapped in cycles of disappearance. They are not only avoiding the other person. Many times they are avoiding their own emotional discomfort, avoiding accountability, avoiding vulnerability, avoiding the fear of being emotionally consumed. And beneath all of this is one powerful psychological truth. Avoidants often associate emotional independence with safety. Depending too much on another person subconsciously feels dangerous to them. Losing emotional control feels dangerous. Needing someone deeply feels dangerous. So when attachment becomes stronger, the nervous system reacts by creating distance to restore what feels familiar, emotional self-protection. But here is the tragedy behind it all. The very thing avoidants secretly want, connection, understanding, closeness, love, is also the thing that activates their deepest fears. So they become trapped between desire and defense. One part of them wants intimacy, another part wants escape, and those two forces create emotional chaos internally. That is why their actions often seem inconsistent. And if you do not understand this psychology, you will personalize everything. You will think their withdrawal defines your worth. But many times, their silence says more about their unresolved emotional patterns than it says about your value as a person. This does not mean you should accept unhealthy treatment. It does not mean waiting forever is healthy. But understanding what drives avoidant behavior allows you to stop blaming yourself for every moment of distance. Because healing begins when you stop carrying responsibility for someone else's internal conflict. And the next truth is even more important. Because most people react to avoidant silence in a way that unknowingly pushes the connection even further away. This is where so many people lose themselves emotionally without even realizing it. The moment an avoidant becomes distant, something inside them panics. Not because they are weak, but because human beings naturally fight to protect emotional bonds that matter to them. The problem is that fear changes behavior, and when fear takes control, people stop responding with clarity and start reacting from emotional survival. That is why the chasing begins. More messages, longer paragraphs, more explanations, more attempts to fix the energy, more efforts to prove love, loyalty, patience, and understanding. At first, it feels reasonable, because when someone important pulls away, the heart wants reassurance. It wants certainty. It wants to restore connection before it disappears completely. But psychologically, something very different starts happening inside the avoidant mind. Every additional attempt to pull them closer can begin to feel like emotional pressure. Not because the affection is wrong, but because avoidants often experience intense emotional focus as loss of freedom. The more emotional weight they feel from another person, the stronger their instinct becomes to create distance again. This is why many people accidentally enter a painful cycle without understanding it. One person fears abandonment, so they move closer. The other fears emotional engulfment, so they move farther away. And both people become trapped inside patterns they cannot see clearly. The anxious person thinks, if I love harder, they will finally feel safe enough to stay. The avoidant thinks, if I get too emotionally involved, I will lose myself. And neither side fully understands the other. This is why chasing rarely creates the result people hope for. The harder someone pushes for immediate reassurance, the more the avoidant nervous system feels emotionally cornered. Even simple questions can begin feeling heavy to them. Why are you ignoring me? Did I do something wrong? Why are you acting different? These questions may come from pain, but to an avoidant, they often feel like emotional demands they are not prepared internally to manage. So instead of moving toward resolution, they retreat further into silence. And this creates one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences a person can go through, because the more disconnected the avoidant becomes, the more desperate the other person feels for answers. And the more desperate that energy becomes, the more intense the avoidant's need for distance grows. It becomes a loop of emotional triggering. But there is another truth that most people do not realize until much later. Avoidants frequently suppress emotions in real time. They disconnect first, then process later. While another person immediately feels grief, panic, sadness, or longing, the avoidant often numbs those feelings temporarily just to function emotionally. On the surface, they may appear perfectly fine. They continue daily routines. They stay distracted. They act unaffected. But suppression is not healing. It is delay. And delayed emotions always return eventually. This is why many avoidants suddenly reappear long after disappearing, not because they forgot the connection, but because emotional reality finally catches up to them once enough space exists. Distance removes pressure, and when pressure disappears, buried emotions slowly rise back to the surface. That is when many avoidants begin reflecting deeply. They think about conversations they ignored, moments they never fully appreciated, people they emotionally pushed away. They replay memories privately. They wonder whether they handled things badly. They question why genuine closeness scared them so much in the first place. But by that point, time has often changed everything. This is why emotional self-control matters so much during avoidant withdrawal. because many people destroy their own peace trying to force understanding from someone who is emotionally shut down. They lose sleep trying to receive clarity from a person who cannot even fully explain themselves internally yet. And the deeper tragedy is this: while focusing completely on the avoidance behavior, they slowly abandon themselves. Their mood begins depending on replies. Their confidence depends on attention. Their emotional stability depends on another person's availability. And this creates suffering far beyond the relationship itself. Because anytime your self-worth becomes attached to another person's consistency, your inner peace becomes fragile. This is the moment where emotional maturity becomes powerful. Real strength is not controlling another person's actions. Real strength is controlling your own emotional response when uncertainty appears. It is remaining grounded when confusion tries to pull you into obsession. It is protecting your dignity even when your emotions want immediate answers. Many people believe love means chasing harder, but healthy emotional energy does not beg for presence. It does not force closeness. It does not lose identity trying to hold on to someone who keeps retreating internally. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stop running after explanations that never come. Because silence can teach lessons words never could. It can reveal where attachment became unhealthy. It can expose emotional wounds that still need healing. It can show how easily fear can make people betray their own self-respect. And most importantly, it can force someone to rediscover their value outside of another person's attention. This does not mean becoming cold or pretending not to care. It means understanding that your emotional stability cannot depend entirely on whether someone chooses to respond. Your life is bigger than one person's inconsistency. And ironically, when people stop chasing avoidance emotionally, something unexpected often happens. The emotional pressure disappears. The dynamic changes. Space replaces intensity. And in that quiet distance, avoidants are sometimes finally able to feel the weight of the connection without feeling trapped by it. But regardless of whether they return or not, the deeper transformation must happen inside you. Because the greatest victory is not getting someone back. It is becoming emotionally strong enough that another person's silence no longer controls your sense of worth. At some point, every person facing emotional distance reaches a crossroads. One path leads deeper into anxiety, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. The other path leads towards self-respect, healing, and inner peace. And the direction your life takes depends on one important decision: whether you continue abandoning yourself for someone who keeps abandoning connection. Because eventually, the real battle is no longer about the avoidant. It becomes about you, about your ability to remain emotionally grounded when affection disappears, about your ability to hold on to your identity when someone else becomes uncertain, about your ability to stop measuring your value through another person's inconsistency. This is where transformation begins. Not when the avoidant finally replies, not when they suddenly explain everything, not when they return with perfect clarity. Real transformation starts the moment you stop making your emotional survival dependent on someone else's attention. That moment changes everything internally, because when people become emotionally attached to silence, they unknowingly place their happiness into another person's hands. Every notification controls their mood. Every delay affects their confidence. Every small interaction determines whether they feel secure or rejected. This creates emotional instability that slowly drains the soul. But the strongest people learn something life-changing. Peace does not come from forcing connection. Peace comes from becoming emotionally secure within yourself. And that kind of strength cannot be taken away by delayed messages, emotional confusion, or temporary distance. It is built from self-awareness, from emotional discipline, from learning how to comfort yourself instead of constantly seeking comfort from unavailable people. Many individuals spend years trying to become enough for emotionally distant partners. More patient, more understanding, more attractive, more supportive. They keep believing that if they finally say the right words or love deeply enough, the avoidant will suddenly stop running from intimacy. But healing another person's emotional wounds is not your responsibility. You cannot rescue someone from fears they refuse to confront within themselves. You cannot build emotional safety for someone who continuously escapes emotional closeness. And no amount of love can create stability inside a person who has not learned how to handle vulnerability internally. This realization hurts at first, because the heart always wants one final answer, one final breakthrough, one final moment where everything suddenly makes sense. But growth often begins when you accept that closure does not always arrive through explanations. Sometimes closure arrives through understanding patterns clearly enough that you no longer need the explanation. And once you understand the pattern, you stop personalizing every moment of withdrawal. You stop asking, why was I not enough? And you begin asking, why did I ignore my own emotional needs, trying to hold on to someone emotionally unavailable? That question changes your life. Because now the focus returns to the one person you truly have control over, yourself. This is where emotional power is rebuilt quietly. You begin protecting your energy instead of chasing reassurance. You stop overextending yourself for temporary validation. You become more aware of what healthy communication feels like, more aware of how peace should feel inside real connection, more aware that love should not constantly leave you emotionally starving, and something incredible starts happening internally. The same silence that once destroyed your confidence slowly loses its power over you, not because you stopped caring completely, but because you stopped losing yourself inside another person's unresolved behavior. You begin understanding that someone else's inability to communicate consistently is not proof that you are unlovable. It is proof that they are struggling with emotional patterns they have not healed yet. That awareness creates freedom. Because many people remain trapped for years trying to earn affection from individuals who are emotionally conflicted within themselves. They keep waiting for consistency from people who are not emotionally consistent internally, and during that process, they neglect their own healing, dreams, goals, and peace of mind. But your life is too valuable to spend entirely waiting for emotional certainty from someone afraid of closeness. There comes a moment where you must decide whether you will continue shrinking yourself to fit inside someone else's limitations, or finally rise into the strongest version of yourself. And the strongest version of you does not beg to be chosen. The strongest version of you understands that genuine connection flows naturally through honesty, effort, emotional availability, and mutual care. It does not constantly feel like emotional survival. It does not leave you trapped in confusion every day. It does not make you question your worth repeatedly. Healthy love brings stability, not constant emotional chaos. That does not mean relationships are perfect. Every human being carries fears and imperfections, but emotionally healthy people communicate. They do not continuously disappear every time vulnerability appears. They do not repeatedly leave others drowning in uncertainty while avoiding difficult emotions. And this is why your healing matters so much. Because once you truly rebuild your self-worth, you stop becoming attracted to emotional unavailability disguised as mystery. You stop confusing inconsistency with passion. You stop romanticizing emotional distance. And instead, you begin valuing calmness, honesty, reliability, and emotional maturity. That is when your entire life begins changing. Not because another person suddenly transformed, but because you did. Sometimes an avoidant silence feels like the end of your world in the moment. But later, many people realize it was actually the beginning of their emotional awakening. It forced them to face insecurities they had ignored. It forced them to rediscover their dignity. It forced them to build an inner stability that no relationship could ever replace. And maybe that is the deepest lesson hidden inside all of this. Sometimes the silence was never sent to break you. Sometimes it arrived to teach you how to stop abandoning yourself. For people who abandon emotional connection the moment things become real. And once you finally learn that lesson, you stop chasing closure, because you become the closure.